Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of Elementary Developer Weekend. Oh, we are glad you are here. Yesterday, we had 4 great talks. We're going to get those recapped right now by Dan and Cassidy, the founder and co-founder of Elementary OS. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome to day 2.
Good morning.
All right. So a recap of yesterday.
Yeah, we kicked off the EDW Day 1 with the 2021 State of the Platform from Dan here. And in that, it was opening keynote, and he had a high-level overview of the App Center platform, major advancements from the last year, things coming in Elementary OS 6, new APIs, new tools, developer tools, growth of the audience, all sorts of great stuff.
Yeah, and then Alessandro showed us a look at Akira, the brand new UX app, and talked about an overview of his initial struggles and motivations behind building it, why he chose Elementary OS as the platform, showed us some really cool features coming and some things you can do to build a really cool app with our native stack.
And then we heard from Anna Cook with Making an Accessible App. And she looked at digital products, how designers and developers can make sure our work is inclusive to disabled people, accessibility, laws, guidelines, and best practices for developers to approach in their apps.
And then we closed out the day with Princeton, who gave us an overview of some of his work in Vala, improving resource usage, and his work on the Vala language server. He talked about where you can find great documentation and tutorials for getting started with learning Vala and some of the next steps that we want to take in making it more accessible to get into the language for everyone.
Excellent. That is day 1, and now it's time for day 2. I want to mention, if you'd like to find links or even the schedule, you can head over to edw.elementary.io, where they'll have all of that now and after as well. Also, if you want to support the project, future development, or events like this, you can support Elementary and EDW by visiting store.elementary.io. You can find devices running Elementary OS, as well as a huge selection of merch, including shirts, jackets, mugs, laptop sleeves. Hey, that's pretty cool. I like that. Posters, of course, pillows as well. Pillows? Man, I gotta get some pillows. So go over there. There's some limited run merch over there at store.elementary.io. Get yourself something and support the project. Now, our first talk today is by Igor, and he's gonna walk you through how to contribute to Elementary OS. Take it away.
So I'm going to start this talk about how to contribute to Elementary. My name's here. This is for Elementary Developer Weekend 21. And then to start with this talk, I know that it's a talk about how to contribute, but I would like to start with why we would want to contribute to Elementary. So why, for me, tells a lot about myself. So for me, I would like to contribute to an open source software because I want to write software that people actually use. And in my case, during my career and my time as a developer, I got to write a lot of software that no one used. So when I was doing my PhD, computer science, I wrote some Python libraries, a lot of machine learning experiments. I learned a lot by doing that, but honestly, no one ever used that code. Also, I worked sometimes as research and development, and it was the same. I worked with Java and optical character recognition, many challenging and interesting things, but the project I worked on was canceled short before I left. So again, I never got to see code that I have written in production where people got to use. So right now, I'm a teaching professor in computer engineering, and I write a lot of code that my students use. But honestly, it's mostly like auto-grading scripts or code examples or prototypes. And it's not really software. It's code that people use, but I'm not like really writing software for other people. So Elementary comes into place because essentially it's the only distro that had stopped me from distro hopping. And I like it because it was designed to stay out of my way, so I could work instead of playing with scripts and configuration files. And it also has awesome community. So for me, Elementary fits very well into this objective, this goal of writing software for people to use, because it helps me with this regard, and it's also the system I use in my everyday life. So knowing why we want to contribute, it's important because obviously it takes time and energy. So it's nice to see why you're doing it. So with why, then we need to know where. So this talk is about technical contributions. There's a lot more that can be done for contributing, like translation and documentation. You can do user support, and there's also financial support through GitHub sponsors or Patreon. These are also very valid ways to contribute, but this talk is about technical contributions. More specifically, when we talk about essentially a code contribution, I think the first thing that you need to do is to find an issue that you would like to work on. So everything else is kind of secondary. And well, Elementary is it's not a small project, so there are lots of repositories in Elementary's GitHub organization, and I think that the first step is just to go through all repositories and find something that is interesting for you. When you're looking for an issue, look for bite size or newcomer tags, because these are supposed to be much easier, and there might be more people available to help you if you're working on bite size or newcomer tags. Specifically, when we come to Elementary here, any of these projects might have this kind of issue, this kind of tags on the issues. So you can just search for something that looks like something you would like to do. So finding an issue is important. It's sometimes very hard to do. So looking for bite size or newcomer tags is a nice way of, getting that first issue ready for you. And then we get to the how. So I think that finding an issue is important because you want to work on something that matters for other people. So it's not like I have this crazy idea, or I think that this should be done like that, and then you just send a contribution out of nowhere. It is good to have an issue to work on because we want to do something that essentially the project managers and maintainers, they already understand that is valuable to the project. So when I talk about how to contribute, we essentially have three parts. There's how to fix the issue, like the act of coding and cloning repository and dealing with Git. Then there is creating an actual pull request with your contributions. And finally, you have to do work so your pull request can get accepted. And this is a high-level view of the workflow that we do when we're sending pull requests to open source projects. And we are going to try and discuss a little bit of each of these three parts. So how to fix the issue will be a live demo on how to download a project, build it, and debug, and try to understand what's going on. How to create a pull request. We will create a pull request live for a dependency problem. And finally, how to get it accepted. We will discuss the relationship between a contributor, usually a not so frequent one like myself, and the maintainers of the project. So these three parts, I'm going to use different issues and different projects in them, and I will try my best to make it very obvious what I'm doing. So for the how to fix an issue part, I separated this bug. This issue was present on terminal a while ago, and basically it said that if you're pasting comments on the terminal, there's that paste protection dialog, and if you press escape, the text gets pasted anyway. Okay, so this issue was already solved, and here we are going to recreate the process of solving this issue. So the point here is not to solve something new, but kind of a look behind the scenes on what happens when someone is trying to solve an issue. And this one is very simple. So it's good for us as well, because it means that we can go very slowly here, and we still have time to discuss what's going on. So the first part would be to go and fork terminal. Okay, so this is the easiest part. You just come and fork it, and this will create like a snapshot of terminal's repository, but under my account. So I already have one. I can just click here, and it goes to my fork. And it works like this because I have permissions to write on my fork, but I don't have permissions to commit and to write on Elementary's terminal, which is the main repository. So I need to create my code, create my contributions, send it to my fork, and then create a pull request that will add the difference between my repository and the official one, Elementary's terminal. And I can get things going from a repository that I don't have permissions to write on. So, okay, I have the terminal here, and I have already then cloned it on my machine. Right now, I'm in the main branch. As it looked before the issue was fixed. So when you look at Git log, I'm about in March 5th. So we're a little bit in the past, but we can also do what we need to do here and fix the issue on this part. So, okay, first step, very simple. We just build it. And this is the easy part, because Elementary in general has very clear instructions. So I just need to basically follow these like 3 lines, and I can build and run my own version of terminal. So let's do it. I just use meson build, prefix user, USR, and I go to the build folder, and I ninja install it. Nothing very complicated. I can just, if I type ninja, I can build it on this folder, and I don't need to actually install it. So I can just run IO elementary terminal, and now I'm running my own version of terminal. Okay, so with this we complete the first part. We have built on our own version, and we're ready to start actually changing things. So one of the important parts about how we can get used to a new project is to actually explore the repository. So if we simply go to source and look at the name of the files, how they're organized, like I have a dialogues folder with foreground process dialog and unsafe paste dialog. I have a widgets, search, toolbar, terminal widget, application, dbus, main window. Terminal is not a very big project, so these are basically the files that we need. It's less than 10 files, not something out of this world. But if we go back to the issue that we want to solve, it's about paste warning pastes on escape. And essentially it means that we're looking at something that happens when the paste protection dialog appears. And we have a file named unsafe paste dialog. So this looks like a very good place to start looking. And this is one of the best things about having a project that has nice names and is organized. Just by looking at the file names, I can already know what's going on and probably understand where I need to fix or where I need to change things. Okay, I have this unsafe paste dialog. It's a message dialog. I'm not sure what this is, so let's look at Valadoc. Valadoc is basically the place to find examples and documentation on Vala. And if we just say Granite message dialog on the search, we get to this page, which displays documentation about this. There's an example, there are some of how to use it, and all the methods that we have. And methods that it inherits from all other classes. Okay, looks fine. There's an example here, it says run, destroy. Okay, looks kind of self-explanatory. And here we have terminal's unsafe space dialog. There's a primary text, some secondary information, buttons, a button don't paste, a button paste anyway, don't paste vet is equal to 1, paste anyway equals to 0. Okay, so we have this. Looks kind of self-explanatory. Now we know that this exists. Let's try and look for where it's used. We can use Ctrl-Shift-F in VS Code, so we can just type unsafe space dialog. And there's a lot of things about translation files. Okay, maybe that's not such a good idea. Okay, so I found it here at main window. We have an occurrence of new unsafe space dialog. Searching for new unsafe space dialog might be a better idea. So we can go here, and we see then what happens when text is pasted on the terminal application. So there's a check here that says, oh, if there's a setting that's that enables this dialog, then this happens. And essentially, it runs the dialog whenever there's sudo on the text and there's more than one line, which seems fine. Seems like a nice idea. Then it runs unsafe space dialog and it checks if the response was 1. It just destroys it and returns. Okay. So if response was 1, then it doesn't paste. Which makes sense because don't paste has value 1 here. Fine. And otherwise, it will continue and the text gets pasted into terminal. So now that we have our version of terminal, we need to try and actually reproduce this bug. So we just come here, sudo, we do some comments, and now we try to run our version of terminal and see if the paste protection dialog appears, and if it does, if the text gets pasted anyway. So we run terminal, and then we try pasting, and apparently the text was pasted directly. So there's something going on. I think there's a setting that says that if I want to show or not the paste protection dialog. But we can also just say, okay, always show it. It's easier for us. I don't need to keep messing around with some settings. I can just say, always show the paste protection dialog, and now it should appear. Yes, say, oh, it's in Portuguese. Now it appears. The paste protection dialog appears, and if I press ask, it really gets pasted anyway. If I press don't paste, it works. So okay, we can reproduce the bug, and we know that's what's going on here. We know that some way, somehow, when I press ask, the default response is not don't paste. So let's check this using a very dirty way of debugging, which is print. Not very nice, but works kind of okay. Oh, sorry. I didn't save it. So now let's see what happens if I, no, not you. If I copy here and I say don't paste, it gives me -4. I'm not sure why, but it does. If I give don't paste, it's 1, okay. If I give paste anyway, it's 0, right? So now we have something to work with. So it means that it only avoids pasting if it's 1. But when I press ask, I get -4. So we might have two problems here. The first one is that if I cancel the dialog, the default response is not don't paste. The second problem is that, okay, maybe I shouldn't be checking for 1 here, but for not 0, because not 0 is paste anyway. So if the user does not press paste anyway, don't paste, which seems like a nice idea, but it would also be interesting that the default response is do not paste. And actually there is this. So if we search here for GTK dialogues, there is a set default response. And let's try and use it. So after creating the buttons, we can just say, okay, I want the default response should be don't paste. And I want to only paste if 0 is received. So you can just go, compile it again. And now we press ask and it doesn't paste. We press don't paste, it doesn't paste. And we press paste anyway, and it does paste. So this would be our desired changes for this, to fix this bug. Now we can actually say that this bug was fixed. I press ask and nothing happens, or in the text only gets pasted if I press paste anyway. Which seems fine. Now we can just git switch to a new branch like escape paste and add our contributions. Default response here, and this is something nice with VS Code. I can so let's go back to what it was before. So this is not something I want in my modifications. The rest is okay. So this would be my commit: fix escape pasting text in new way, and it works. So now that I have this, I can just push to my fork. Just push this branch to my fork. It takes a little bit of time, but eventually it works, and this will appear here as a new branch. Yes, it says escape paste has had had recent pushes less than a minute ago. So now I have my contributions on my fork, and I can go and do something else. So okay, we fixed the issue. Now there's a summary here about how you do all the steps that we just did. And with the code on my fork, then we would proceed to create a pull request. Okay, so let's look at how to create a pull request. So we'll be looking at this other bug here on missing dependencies on switchboard plug parental controls. And this time we'll go through the entire process. It's a much simpler bug because I just need to edit a single markdown file. So we have it here already working, and then the bug is very simple. It just says that there's missing flatpak and malcontent dependencies on the README file. So README cites all of this, but it's not citing lib flatpak dev and lib malcontent 0 dev, I think. Yes, these two. So it's just these two lines, and then we can create a new branch, fix dependency issues, we add it, and add dependencies to README. And we send it to our fork as well. I hate this. Oh my god. It's mine? I can just push. I could swear minus u was the same as set upstream 2, but whatever. So now I have this on my fork, which is here. It says fix dependency issues, and I can compare and pull requests. So it's very simple. I can just say, okay, add dependencies to README, but one of the nicest things about GitHub and this kind of pull request style things is that I can link a pull request with an issue. So if I say this fixes 149, and when I create this, it will when this is accepted, the issue will be automatically closed. So doing this is very nice, and I can just go here and see what I'm contributing. It's just a diff. I create the pull request, and now it should be ready for maintainers to review. And here we can see that the issue was correctly linked. So when I come here, it says that successfully merging a pull request may close this issue. So, okay, we can then create pull requests. We will have to address requests for modifications and keep updating our pull requests until it gets merged. So pull requests are between branches. So if I need to add something more, like I made a typo or there are suggestions to improve my pull request, I can just keep pushing on the same branch. I don't need to create a second pull request if maintainers ask me for more things. And in fact, when we have a pull request, it's where the contribution actually starts, because contributing is not really a one-way street. So when you send a pull request, a maintainer has to review your code. They will suggest improvements, but they are also committing to support your code and evolve it for future releases. Essentially, if I send a pull request, I'm not part of the team. I'm not I'm just a regular external contributor. So if I commit something, if I send a pull request and it gets accepted and somehow it breaks things, it's the maintainer's problems, it's not mine. At the same time, if this proposal makes creating new features hard, it's the maintainer's problems. It's not really your problem or my problem. So with this, what I would like to say is that when you send a pull request, you're actually requesting for an exchange of value and responsibility between a contributor and the maintainers. So of course you are given code, that's okay, you're giving your time, your energy, but they are giving you back the responsibility of making sure that this code will work for future releases, and that essentially that if it breaks or whatever happens, they will be responsible for it. So in my view, it's not even a zero-sum game or of some sort. It's really a win-win situation. What I get from the project, it's much more than what I can give. So in this sense, for me, the maintainers' work is very special because it means that they are taking responsibility for a lot of things. And finally, bringing this, with this in mind, let's see the type of interaction that happens when you send a pull request. So in this case, it's an issue with camera that's a mirror image was created. So if you showed some text, the text was flipped. The user is requesting either for it to be flipped by default or to have an option to do it. So I decided to try and tackle this issue, and this is my first suggestion. It kind of looks okay, but it's not very good in the sense that the switch has a strange size. It's probably not on the correct side of the label. And I also said, okay, maybe this is also a nice idea. So flipping works right from the start. But after suggestions, it evolved into this. Apparently this was a bad idea because I understood that people wanted me to put a mode button, and it was actually a model button like this. So Cassidy sent me a picture basically saying it should look like this. So yeah, I made it look like this. And the final version had correct padding and margins and sizing for everything. So the evolution from the first version to this took a lot of interaction, and I wouldn't do this by myself. This only happens because I had the support and the interaction between me and the maintainers and people at Elementary from the core team. So essentially, if you want to get a PR merged, you must follow the project's guidelines, especially code formatting and design language. But really, be a nice person, be polite, and accept criticism, improve upon suggestions, because when you send a pull request, you're actually asking people to work for you and with you. So be nice, like do whatever you do when you're requesting someone to do work for you. So my final thoughts on this would be that for me, contributing made me a better developer and also a better teacher. I also really liked learning a lot about design, which is something that I did not value before. And finally, I think that the community is great. It's very welcoming, and if you want to contribute, I'm pretty sure that you will be welcomed as well. So that's it. Thank you for your time. So I'm going to start this talk about how to contribute to Elementary. My name's here. This is for Elementary Developer Weekend 21. And then to start with this talk, I know that it's a talk about how to contribute, but I would like to start with why we would want to contribute to Elementary. So why, for me, tells a lot about myself. So for me, I would like to contribute to an open source software because I want to write software that people actually use. And in my case, during my career and my time as a developer, I got to write a lot of software that no one used. So.
And now, a live Q&A with Igor and Elementary founder Daniel Foray.
Hey, Igor, thanks a lot for your talk, man. That was really awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we got a lot of great questions from chat, but I wanted to ask you first, was that README pull request accepted? I saw that Cassidy requested some changes on that, but did it ultimately get in?
Oh yeah, it did. So it was very simple, like alphabetize the list, and then I just pushed to the branch again, and it automatically updates the pull request. So yeah, it did get accepted. Thank you.
Awesome. So, one of the questions that I'm seeing a lot in chat and in our community in general is people want to know, is it okay to just jump in and send a pull request unsolicited? Do you need to ask permission first before you contribute, or how does that work?
I don't think that you need to ask permission, but it's nice to let people know that you're trying to work on something. So usually a comment on an issue is sufficient. And sometimes people try and do something and then they drop it. So if someone else has already taken the issue, you can see personally and ask if they're working on it or if it's already free.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And, is there a way to see on GitHub if someone's already working on a solution for an issue or already has a pull request?
Well, you can link issues and pull requests. So every time you use the issue number or the pull request number in messages, you link like this was mentioned in this place or that place. And for pull requests, you can use fixes or closes in the number of the issue. And if the pull request is accepted, then the issue is automatically closed. So it's very nice, actually.
Yeah, that seems like it's fairly straightforward to see if an issue is still open or anything like that, right? A lot of people want to know, like, how do they find a good place to start? Like, is there a place that they can go to see, like, what are beginner issues or something that is a little bit easier for them to tackle?
Oh, yes, there actually is. So Elementary tags issues as white size or sometimes newcomers. It's a label. So you can just go into the Elementary organization and you can search for white size label. And at least, I think right now there are 47 or around 40 issues that were already classified by Elementary maintainers or contributors. It's good for newcomers. And It usually means that the fix is 2 or 3 lines. It's not very complicated.
Yeah, that's a great resource for people to get started. And some people want to know too, like, when you're first getting into a code base, even for a bite-sized issue, like it can be a little daunting, right? To search through all the different code files and try to find out what exactly should I be fixing, like where the problem is. So is there a place that, people can get help to try to figure out like where an issue might be coming from?
Well, I do 2 things that are kind of silly, but they work very well. So we're using GUI applications, so I can global search the text on the interface. And it usually gets me quite close to where the thing happens, or at least where that portion of the code starts running. So this is something useful. I kind of use print a lot because I'm not very good debugging Vala, but I can debug Vala visually and step codes line by line. And I think
what about
this is the main point. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I'm finished. Please.
Okay. What about like a community chat or something? Is there somewhere that I can ask a person, if I'm really stuck?
Oh, there's the Slack channel. You can ask for an invite. I guess that's the main place to ask for help. I used Slack some time ago to ask for someone to review a pull request or ask for help or an opinion, and it worked quite well.
So, I notice a lot of times when people are doing their commits that they have some kind of a commit convention that you need to follow in GitHub or something like that. Does Elementary have a convention that you need to follow with your commits in order to contribute?
There are best practices, but they're not enforced in a pull request. So when a maintainer accepts a pull request, they can edit the commit message. And usually if the commit message is not very good, someone will suggest you a way to improve it. But a contribution won't be like denied or blocked because the commit message was not good. The maintainer can just edit while merging the pull request, and they also squash commits. So you can add lots of commits, then in the end, it will become only one that fixes the issue.
Yeah, so it sounds like you don't really need to worry too much about working maybe in a little bit of a messy way while you're still trying to figure things out.
No, you can be messy as long as the final version is okay. The rest can just disappear while merging.
Yeah, that's great. What about the kinds of programming languages and toolkits you need to know to contribute? Is there like a bunch of different stuff that you need to know?
Well, luckily it's only Vala and GTK. So some projects use different libraries according to what they do, like Camera uses GStreamer, but that's expected for Camera. But mostly it's just Vala and GTK.
That's great. Yeah. So someone else is asking here about events like Hacktoberfest.
So last year, I believe that Elementary had tagged all their repositories using Hacktoberfest, so people could send pull requests and participate in the event. I think I did, so I got a t-shirt by sending stuff to Elementary. And
yeah, that's great. Marius in chat wants to know, it's a bit more of like a personal question, but how do you overcome the fear of rejection in regard to pull requests?
Well, honestly, in Elementary, people are very welcoming. So I've never seen an interaction with me or with students that I have that tried to contribute that was like derogative or rude in any way. So if you have an issue that you would like to solve and you send an honest attempt at solving it, people will usually be very nice and supportive and try to improve on what you did. So yeah, I guess the community is very welcoming. I don't have a very good answer for this, but people are nice, so you shouldn't worry that much. That's what I see.
I'm really glad that's been your experience. I think like that's something that we try to do is make sure that we don't really like outright reject pull requests very much. You usually will have changes requested, but it's always in the interests of like, okay, let's fix this and make it better, but not like outright reject it, right?
Yeah, and I have received a lot of the comments on the things I sent, and they're usually very positive and like they make the thing better. So there are many things that eventually got accepted that I wouldn't have been able to do it by myself.
Okay, and we have one more question here. Proximia wants to know, is there a good one-stop place where they can learn how to develop for Elementary OS?
Well, there's the for apps, there's developer.elementary.io. There's a contribute section on the website as well. that lists some tricks and tips on how to contribute to more involved things like wing panel that involve like killing your current wing panel and then running a new one. There's Valadoc, which is very useful. These are the ones I use the most. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I think that's the best one too. Is that developer.elementary.io has the best resources there, and there's the contributor docs, like you said. We have the developer guide, which it's more focused on learning to write your first app, but all those skills transfer to contributing to elementary OS components too, because it's all GTK and Vala and all the same skills, and there's documentation there to show you how to use the different APIs as well. All right. Well, thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for joining us for a quick Q&A.
Thanks for having me.
Very good. Thank you, Igor. Now, coming up on the stream, we have my experience. We have my experience as a visually impaired developer.
Presented by Justin Campbell, this talk explores a visually impaired developer's day-to-day use of elementary OS and how it compares to other platforms.
Hi, welcome to a look at using and developing for elementary OS from a low vision point of view. My name is Justin. I'm a technical project manager at Purdue University's Engineering Computing Network. I'm a computer enthusiast who humanizes technology through design and development. I'm also legally blind. What does that mean? It means that a person has less than or at 2200 vision without correction. Practically, that means that someone with perfect vision, 20/20 vision, can look at something from 200 feet away and see it clearly. However, I, or someone else who is legally blind, wouldn't be able to see it clearly from that distance, and instead would need to be about 20 feet or closer before they saw it with the same clarity that someone with perfect vision at 200 feet sees it. What does that mean for computer usage? It means that I use magnifiers a lot and other accessibility tools. So you know a little bit about me and how I use computers. Let's talk about using elementary for me. First, I want to get some things out of the way. What this talk is not is a tutorial for creating applications. The elementary project has great documentation that I suggest you look at, and I'm a web developer, not a desktop application developer. This is not a comparison of native and web technologies. For that, I suggest you check out the GTK for Web Developers talk. Really, this isn't a technical talk at all. So what is this? This is a critique of elementary OS's low vision accessibility tools, their magnifier, screen reader, keyboard shortcuts, and the like. It is a review of elementary OS's developer tools from the point of view of a low vision developer. In this talk, I'm talking about my experience not just as a low vision user, but as a low vision user trying to develop applications for other low vision users on the platform. Subsequently, this talk is also a call for help, because the people who need these types of tools, like magnifiers and screen readers, are typically the best people to design these tools. However, because these tools need to be in place before someone can use them, that means that the people who are best able to design these tools are often the least able to create these tools. So let's talk about using elementary, starting with its installation. Off the bat, you should know that I did not install elementary in a typical way. Rather than having a live USB or other external media, I used VirtualBox to install elementary OS to an external drive. This is for two reasons. One is because I wanted to use an external drive to experience elementary OS, the same installation, across multiple devices, my desktop, my laptop, other people's computers, and get a feel for how it's going to be with different peripheral setups, different pointing devices, different screen sizes. The second is because during the installation of Elementary, there is no magnifier, the tool that I use primarily to interact with text-based or UI-based interfaces. So during installation, I used macOS's built-in magnifier to see the text that I could see. You'll notice with the screenshot on screen that some of the installer is cut off here. This isn't an issue with Elementary, rather it's an issue with VirtualBox not properly setting the screen size. So here, some of the elements required for interacting with the installer are off screen. However, I was able to use the Orca screen reader, which is available in the installer, to interact with and navigate the elements that are off screen. This was an unintentional but very good exercise for navigating the screen as a completely blind user, and it worked well. Big props to the Elementary project here for having clear descriptions of the UI elements that I was selecting and a clear path forward for getting things configured. Now, after initial installation and setup, I was greeted with the first login screen. At the login screen, there's still no magnifier. There are a couple of things to note here. On a single user system, this may be okay. As a low vision user, I can assume that a single login card is something that is meant for me. I enter my password and log in. However, for people using a multi-user system, this may be more complicated, and having these tools available both in the installer and the login screen would make it easier for low vision users to use the system, especially at the setup phase. After the initial login, I noticed that there is a beautiful desktop. However, there's no affordance of the tools that make it accessible. I knew, based on guessing, that meta plus equals allows me to zoom in with the magnifier that is enabled by default. Meta plus minus allows me to zoom out from the magnifier. There are other keyboard shortcuts that allow the navigation of the system. However, they're hidden in the shortcut overlay accessible by the meta key. These tools are here, and the keyboard shortcuts being available after login make them usable. However, not knowing about those keyboard shortcuts, not having been told about them as a low vision user, if I were very new to the system and couldn't make these educated guesses, the tools may as well not exist, despite how good they are. So if I had a recommendation for the installation process, I'd say copy where it works. For macOS Big Sur, there was the introduction of the first screen of the installer being an option to turn on accessibility tools. From here, I could turn on the magnifier for macOS Big Sur and toggle it with a keyboard and mouse combination of Control plus Scroll. This keyboard combination is something I've come to use over the past 10 years, so I have a bit of bias about how much I like it. However, the more that I use other systems that do not combine keyboard and mouse shortcuts for their accessibility tools, the more I come to appreciate it. This is because when I am in the magnifier, I am entirely bound by my mouse to navigate the screen because I only see a small subpart of it. So to have a magnifier that is entirely controlled by keyboard shortcuts that require two hands no less, then I am forced to move my hand from my mouse, my primary navigation tool, to the keyboard every time I want to engage or disengage the magnifier. For someone like me who does this tens of times a minute, it is a huge bottleneck to the workflow and rather disorienting. If there were one thing that I were to request from this presentation, it's to have a combination of keyboard and mouse shortcuts to allow the magnifier to be used. Thanks. Moving on. For general usage, I'm not going to go through a step-by-step guide on how I configured my system or things that got in my way, but I will touch on a few things that are critical for me in navigating a system as a low vision user. The first one here is window management. I'm coming from macOS. I use a tool called Shiftit to manage my windows. Shiftit allows me to snap to the left, snap to the right, as well as snap to one of 4 quadrants, and give me granular control over the size of a window, so that at any arbitrary place, I can increase or decrease the whole window, allowing me for incredibly granular keyboard-centric window management. This, combined with application switcher abilities, allows me to virtually to control my windows virtually without ever touching my mouse. On elementary OS, I have some basics. I have what I needed for this review. I can snap to the left and I can snap to the right, as well as magnify and unmagnify to the original position. I would like to see more granular keyboard-based control, ideally that's matched with other input devices for window management, so that when I get into something more complex, like a 3-window setup or an uneven window setup, for example, when using the code editor provided by elementary OS, that won't snap exactly to half the screen. Another bit is that while I am in my magnifier, the ability to have drag and drop control over different UI elements is critical. This is because I have direct correlation with what I'm seeing on screen and the actions that I'm performing. On macOS, while zoomed in, I can drag a file through the file manager into one of my bookmarks, or I can drag it out of the file manager and onto my desktop for easy access later. However, with elementary OS files, I can't do this. When I drag a file into my shortcuts, it prompts me to have that as another shortcut, but not move it into the destination. And with the non-existent desktop feature of storing files on the desktop or in a desktop folder, dragging it out of the file viewer also was impossible. What I was left with was having to use Control-C and Control-V to copy and paste a file. However, without some system level keyboard shortcuts for navigating particular folders, like Command-Shift-H to go to my home folder in macOS, this became a bit tedious. I later learned that I could use Control-L, like in a browser, to start controlling my path bar and type in something like ~/ to reference my home folder. However, this is a text-centric use, and without my magnifier already being in place and zoomed into the appropriate level, it's sometimes difficult to guess where I am. Moving forward, there's also other text-based things that are limiting for a low vision user like me. One of those is filtering. In macOS's Finder, the default behavior when you start to type while a window is open is to filter the selection of the current directory open based on what you're typing. For example, if I type DOW and I have a downloads folder, then the downloads folder is selected and highlighted, a strong visual cue that this is now the active element. I can then interact with it via the keyboard using Command down or Command up to navigate down or into or out of folders appropriately. In files, the default behavior is to search and give me a list of all of the possibilities of my search term. This is useful. However, it's not as visually it's not as visually easy as the filter and highlight method of macOS's Finder. Furthermore, on remote file systems, files will try to index quickly the entire file system or a subset of the file system, but it does take several seconds for me to get visual feedback when I'm doing this. Some other text-based things around the system are, in macOS, I use iTerm2, my font size is set, and my font size is set, and I am able to rely on my applications reopening with a set font size. However, in the terminal of elementary, while I can change my font size by a percentage amount, when I close the terminal and reopen it, my font zooming settings are no longer set. This became rather irritating as I switch in and out of the terminal for compiling application code, for navigating trees, for using command line utilities, and the like. I would really like to see an option to fix a text size in my terminal, and particularly fix a text size in my terminal that is at a point or pixel counter rather than a percentage. Other text-based things are now going to be getting into particular tools. In VS Code, for example, my editor of choice, though I can't use this for application development on elementary for its lack of Vala support, when I select text within matching brackets, as I am next to the bracket will be highlighted in a light gray, but the text highlighted in a light blue. In elementary OS's code, for the same example, if I'm next to a bracket, both brackets are highlighted in a medium gray, and the text that I'm selecting is highlighted in a medium gray. This led to some confusion as I was manipulating text, because when I would select the text in this example in between two angle brackets, the angle brackets would highlight, suggesting I had them selected when I didn't. So at this point, you might say, these aren't important things. These are very small details. These are things that you can change with adding keyboard shortcuts or implementing more control in the gestures and keyboard shortcut menus of the operating system. These are aesthetic things. These are minor differences that don't affect the overall usage of the system. And with that, I would agree with you, which brings me to this. While I have been nitpicky about the things I'm talking about in elementary OS, with things like I want different shortcuts or I want my text to be highlighted in a different color, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say that I couldn't install elementary OS. I didn't say I couldn't connect to the internet or had problems with Wi-Fi. I didn't say my peripheral of some sort didn't work, that my display driver wasn't configured properly, or any of the other common desktop Linux complaints. Everything worked out of the box. I had access to the tools that I needed, albeit they didn't behave in exactly the same way that I wanted them to. This is a big plus from the desktop Linux that I knew 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. Elementary OS is the most accessible desktop Linux experience I've had as a low vision user, even compared to some of the bigger names like Ubuntu or OpenSUSE. On top of that, elementary OS has the best developer story I've ever seen on a Linux desktop. As I went through and tried to develop my basic applications, the instructions were clear, concise. They gave me a simple click next to follow the new tutorial. And there's a complete developer story outside of the how, with the ability to create applications, package them as flat packs, put them in the App Store, and monetize them. There is a top to bottom solution for moving from having no application to solve a problem to having an application available to users in a standardized way, accessible via magnifiers and keyboard shortcuts and other accessibility tools, with the added benefit that developers have a reason to keep putting this effort into their application on top of base functionality. That effort is adding accessible design or revisiting accessible design translations and other forms of engagement with their users, because they might be able to receive a bit of money from there. Lastly, it's up to the developers now to design their applications with accessibility in mind. While there are ways in which elementary can improve, like including some more scaffolding in the Granite library, their GTK extension library, for the most part, it's ready. As a low vision developer, I was able to install the system, get my developer tools, make a couple of simple applications, ship them on the App Store, install them myself, and get the other tools that I needed for work. I was able to install Google Chrome and Zoom for this call, as well as Slack and other editors like VS Code. Granted, I had to jump through some hoops to get Flatpaks working or install some things from Snap or get some things from Debs, but everything was there. The functionality is existent. And with some minor tweaking and some improvement moving forward, I think that elementary can stay on top of the accessibility game, fundamentally changing the usage of a computer for some people who otherwise don't have options. With that in mind, I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, there's a live Q&A following this talk, as well as the ability to contact me on social media. On most platforms, I am available at TechDev5521.
We're going to continue the conversation on accessibility in just a moment. As day 2 continues on, I want to remind you can support the project and events like EDW and get yourself something pretty great too. Store.elementary.io for devices and a huge selection of merch, including shirts, jackets, mugs, laptops, supposedly rumored pillows, although I've never seen it. I don't know if that's actually true. You'll have to go to the store and tell me if it's true in the chat room. Store.elementary.io. I think there's even limited EDW merch. It's just going to be available during the event, sort of a special one-off. So go grab that at edw.elementary, or I'm sorry, at store.elementary.io. And links to this and talks and schedule is also at edw.elementary.io. 2 links to remember. We have them there up on the screen for you. One for merch and one for schedules and all that information. So go visit those as the day goes on. But now we're going to continue the conversation on accessibility.
Justin couldn't make it for Q&A today, but don't worry, Dan and Cassidy are back.
Yeah, it was a great talk looking at how important accessibility is in an operating system and how it compares to other platforms. Real quick, Chris was talking about pillows. He'd never seen them before, but I do happen to have an EDW pillow right here. So if you are wondering what they look like, how nice and plush they are, and what's on the back side, because I know we don't have that on the website. So you got a little cool neon elementary logo there. So yeah,
I love that they're double-sided.
They're so cool. Yeah, and they're very, very comfortable. I have fallen asleep several times on the couch with this pillow. So they're very nice pillows. Highly recommended. The t-shirts and tank tops are also nice, and so they're the super soft, like tri-blend cotton stuff. So all good merch there. But yeah, let's continue this conversation about accessibility in Elementary OS, especially looking at Elementary OS 6 and some of the improvements that have been made and the progress we've been making there. So I guess first, I want to preface that we went through the 8 issues raised in the talk with Justin, and we've made sure they were all filed. We actually have, we've been working on this long-term project called Accessibility Features Are Just Features, and we've written a few blog posts about those. So these issues are important to us, and we know they're important to users. Dan, if there's any developers out there who are able and willing to tackle some of those accessibility issues, where can they go and where can they find those?
Yeah, well, so we have a projects page on GitHub organization. So if you go to github.com/elementary, there's a tab there that's projects, and we have all of our ongoing projects there, including this accessibility one. So you can see right there where we have all these issues kind of laid out and triaged on a big project board, and that's the best place to find to get involved with accessibility projects or any other project too.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where we always try to put those issues. And it's cool because it's nice to see how somebody might think it's just a pet issue for themselves. So, this just affects me. I have some bad eyesight or something, but it's like, no, it can affect users all over the place. Kind of on that note, what are some of the accessibility improvements that have made it into Elementary OS 6 thus far?
Yeah, there's been a huge actual a focus recently on really improving things like contrast. We've gone through, and Anna mentioned in her talk, using a lot of these tools like color contrast checking. And so the new style sheet is really focused on trying to meet at least that AA level of compliance with all the different accent colors in both the light style and in the dark style. So that's a huge one, is just trying to make sure that things are legible. But also, we're really diligent about trying to make sure that we have tooltips on everything and on images, because it is important for things like screen readers to be able to read out like what a thing is, or for you to be able to get a little bit more information if you're maybe having trouble making out what an icon is. And speaking of icons, there's actually been a ton of work to make icon shapes a little bit more distinguishable, especially at small sizes, and reduce the amount of overlap and things like that. So we've been really working a lot on our visual style to try to make things more clear.
Yeah, and then there's also the text scaling, text size feature. That's another big one for, not only can you zoom in on the screen itself, but you can actually increase the size of the text throughout the whole operating system. And that increases the size of the user interface elements, makes everything more easy to view. And that's great for hardware. It's great for people who may have impaired vision or may, have a certain screen resolution that doesn't work quite as well out of the box. So that's another example of how accessibility features help improve the experience for everyone.
Yeah, that's a huge one because, in Elementary OS 5, we did have the text scaling features built in. And it's funny, a lot of people think that they need to go install a special tweaks app to change text scaling, but that's been a built-in feature. But now it's not just text scaling, because we realized that like when you start pumping up the text, that spacing can get awkward and it looks weird. And we had this really like second class experience for people that needed larger text. And so we've really gone through and make sure that that also affects the spacing in the UI, so things still look natural. And you're not getting this kind of like, you can increase text, but it's not a great experience. Like now it's something that we're actively testing and making sure that like this is a good, consistent experience no matter what size you need your text to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this was something Anna mentioned in her accessibility talk yesterday. So if you're interested in this topic and you're watching at home, be sure to catch Anna's talk from yesterday as well. There's a lot of good information about developing apps and experiences for people with disabilities. But what are some ways to ensure that your app is going to be accessible by default when you develop on Elementary OS? Can you touch on that a bit?
Yeah, there's a big one that a lot of people get intimidated when they're starting, because they're like, I don't know what tools I need or what checkers or what, or how can I do that? And one of the biggest tools to test for accessibility is to use the tab key on your keyboard. Just test keyboard navigation, because solving keyboard navigation is a huge part of lots of different accessibility tools, including screen readers or things for people with mobility disorders. So if you can work on keyboard navigation, that's going to be a huge one that's going to help a lot of different kinds of people, and not just people with accessibility needs, but it's also a huge feature for people that just really like getting around that way, like developers, right? So you're not just going to be working on something that a subset of your users are going to use, but it's something that benefits the experience for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And another point on that is not doing more in your app, not overriding the defaults in your app. That's something we see in a lot of apps with keyboard accessibility specifically is, GTK built in, the toolkit has keyboard navigation built into it and focus states, and it has built-in ways to say this is the default button in a dialogue, instead of saying, hey, grab focus, or you mess with focus in weird ways, or change what happens when you hit the right arrow key versus the tab key. Instead of doing all that extra work, lean on the toolkit itself to do the defaults, and then you're more guaranteed that it's going to be accessible as well. Let's see.
A lot of great points.
Checking out the chat for more questions here. Do you have something there?
Yeah, someone asked about global screen zoom in and out, and they wanted to know, how to access that. And so we've had for quite a while, you can use super plus or minus to zoom in. And thanks to some feedback from some people in our community, in Elementary OS 6, we've increased the amount of zoom you can do. So now you can zoom in like really, really far. And thanks to Jose's work on multi-touch, you can assign a multi-touch gesture to zoom as well. So it's a lot easier for you to assign that to a gesture and be able to zoom in as you're navigating, because we've seen that a lot of people, they'll zoom in and then zoom out, and then they'll kind of use the UI and they'll zoom in like as you need it. So it's not necessarily something that like you're always zoomed in, like it needs to be quickly accessible, right?
Yeah. And I know there's also an open issue. Multi-touch is great if you have a trackpad. I love it. I've started using a trackpad on the desktop because of these awesome gestures. But if you're using a more traditional mouse, there's an open issue as well to do like a super scroll in Gala as well. So, and that's on that project board we mentioned earlier. The accessibility features are just features project board. If you're a developer and interested in implementing that, that would be great. And I'm sure building on the multi-touch zoom and the super plus and minus zoom would be a good idea there.
Yeah. That's something that Anna touched on in her talk, right? Is we want to make sure that we have multiple ways to access features. And that's the best way to make them accessible is to make sure that you have multiple interaction methods.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think there might be a another more of an answer here as well. Varun Singh asked, how can we test apps we make to make sure their accessibility is working as intended? We talked about keyboard focus. What are some other ways?
To open up the screen reader, open up the screen reader, because that's a built-in feature, and just close your eyes or turn off your monitor and see what happens when you do that, and just kind of try to experience it through those eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and another one is ensuring your app works in some of the new features in Elementary OS 6, like the user preference for a dark style. I know people sometimes don't see the dark style as an accessibility feature, but personally, I get migraines sometimes and I need to make everything dark. And so it's great when apps follow that preference as well. So just ensuring your app works with all of the accessibility features that are built into the operating system. You can test it with the on-screen keyboard as well. That's there. Check out the settings in Elementary OS and just poke around with the ones that you might not use normally.
That's a great example.
Go ahead.
Sorry, that's a great example of temporary disability too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And something that's a temporary disability that I think almost all of us has experienced is take your laptop outside and see what it's like in a bright environment. And you can see then how important contrast is too.
Yeah. That's when in code, that's when I use the high contrast mode in code. I don't usually need high contrast in things, but man, when my laptop screen, no matter how bright it is, when it's in direct sunlight, you need as much contrast as you can get. So yeah, testing out all those options that are available in the operating system. Another one was, the dyslexic text mode. This kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier of don't do more than you have to in your app. You don't have to set all these fancy fonts if you don't want to, or if you do, make sure it works when the operating system switches out the default fonts as well, like for the dyslexic text, or even features like the screenshot tool, switching out the fonts. So don't do more than you have to. I feel like that's good programming advice in general, is don't do any more than you have to. And then you get to lean on the operating system and the toolkit and all of the accessibility features that are built in there.
Yeah.
Checking the chat here for any more questions. We've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, we can get a couple more accessibility questions in chat. That would be great.
I'm trying to think of more accessibility features in Elementary OS 6 specifically. I know there's been work in the greeter. That was something that Justin raised in his talk, is that we don't currently have that zoom feature in the greeter. It's just in the session. So that's something, there's an open issue there. That's something we can look at. But we did add other accessibility options in there, like the screen reader and the on-screen keyboard as well.
Yeah, and bringing those to the installer session as well. And that's another big one, is we now show that accessibility indicator in the greeter and in the installer session, so that you can get to things like the on-screen keyboard.
Yeah. So it's always an ongoing project to ensure that we aren't just building those into the session once you've already gotten in, but that you can actually get into your session and get it installed. It's definitely important. Let's see. Looking in the chat here. I think that might be it for questions. Thanks again, everybody, for watching that talk. And sorry, Justin couldn't be here, but hopefully our little impromptu Q&A helped answer some questions. Again, check out that GitHub project board at github.com/orgs/elementary/projects/35. Sorry, that's a little bit of a long. You can also just go to github.com/elementary and view projects there. And it's the accessibility features are just features for a lot more issues that we can tackle.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was very great. It was actually really fascinating to hear the platform's position on those. And I want to thank you to everyone who made EDW possible. Elementary Developer Weekend is made possible by the sponsors you see up on the screen, plus over 500 reoccurring GitHub sponsors. View them all and consider adding your name, github.com/sponsors/elementary. And then a reminder too, links to what we've talked about, the schedule, all of that, edw.elementary.io. And that limited merch, including the pillow. The pillow is real. Pillow confirmed, Wes.
Ooh, revealed here at EDW.
Now I gotta have it. I want to have a pillow, and it makes me want to have a rocket pillow too. So go find that, store.elementary.io. Who knew? Wes said it wasn't true. All right, well, There's more to come on day 2, including a talk that I think is going to be extremely illuminating, and that is creating compelling app icons.
Presented by Micah Ilbery, this talk will teach you about the human interface guidelines around icons, why having a good app icon matters, and how to make one.
Hi, I'm Micah Ilbery, and welcome to Creating Compelling App Icons. In this talk, I hope to give you a better understanding of what makes a good icon and how to go about making those icons. Let's start with some introductions. Who am I? What do I do? And why should you listen to me? Well, as I said, my name is Micah Ilbery. I'm a designer, and most of the contributions I've made to Elementary and its community have been through icons. If you've been around this community long enough, you've probably seen something I've worked on, whether you know me or not. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's talk icons. Why are good icons important, and what makes a good icon? Well, let's start with why a good icon is important. And for that, we need to look no further than App Center. The front or search pages of App Center are the potential user's first impression of your app. As you can see in the screenshot, even if you're in the What's New banner of App Center, the most information a potential user has is your app icon, your app name, and a short description of your app. So the first visual impression a potential user has of your app is your icon. If it's a bad impression, you may never get the chance to win them over further with screenshots or a longer description. You really want to make that first impression a good one. So, how do we go about making that icon that gives that good first impression? Well, for this, we can look at the Human Interface Guidelines, or the HIG, in the iconography section. I'm not going to read the HIG word for word with you, although I do recommend you read it in its entirety, as it's a great resource. But I would like to show you an example icon I made for this talk, break it down, and explain the HIG as we go. Just a quick disclaimer. Before we get started, I want to make it clear that this won't be a step-by-step tutorial on how to use a specific program like Inkscape, as we just don't have enough time for that, and it's a little out of scope for this talk. However, most vector editors that can export SVGs should work. Also, unfortunately, there are no cheat codes for making icons. It's going to take a little time and a little practice, but if you're willing to put in the work, you'll be rewarded with a beautiful icon that gives that extra polish to your app. For our example, we'll be using this developer chat icon. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk shape and metaphor. Let's start by taking a good look at your app and start thinking about what metaphor to work from. Choosing a metaphor is something that you're going to have to let your app influence. Does its name invoke an image? Does its function, what it does that invoke an image? Or even, is your app interesting looking enough that the icon can be a little mini version of itself? The metaphor you choose should influence the shape of your icon. But whatever that metaphor you choose, you're going to want to make sure that your icon has a unique shape and silhouette. This makes your app easier to spot at a glance and makes it more memorable. Rounded squares and circles are great for some use cases, but definitely not all, and your icon is going to have a much harder time standing out when using these shapes. As you can see in our example, we're using a chat bubble shape, as opposed to a square or a circle. If we strip back all the details of the icon and use nothing but shape alone, you can see that its shape is unique and much easier to pick out of the lineup in the dock. And because we let our metaphor influence our shape, you can understand that the primary purpose of our app is to chat just by the shape alone. Next, let's talk icon sizes. For app icons, you really only need to worry about 5 canvas sizes: 16, 32, 48, 64, and 128 pixels squared. Each of these sizes are used in various parts of the desktop, so it's important to include them all. A mistake I see all too often is just making one of the sizes and scaling it up or down for the others, and I'm going to explain why that doesn't really work. Although SVGs are technically scalable, you're still working within the constraints of pixels on a screen. There's no such thing as a fraction of a pixel, so any edges or details that don't align to a full pixel, the computer is going to try and approximate and spread them out to the nearest full pixels. This leads to fuzzy edges and blurry details. To stop that from happening, we pixel fit our icons to each size. Basically, this just means recreating our icons at each size so it aligns to the pixel grid at all times. This keeps our icons looking crisp and recognizable. Let's look at this example. Here we have two sets of icons. On the first set, they've all been pixel fitted. And on the second set, only one size of the icon was made and then scaled down to fit the other sizes. As you can see that as we get smaller and smaller on that scaled set, the icon's edges and details get blurrier and blurrier until at the smallest size, we can't really make out what's going on outside of the context of the other icons. Whereas in our pixel fitted row, every size has crisp, defined edges and better clarity all around. Here in these screenshots, you can see why the different of icon sizes matter and where they're used, like the dock, application launcher, app center, menus. And that's why we need to hint or pixel fit for each of them. Again, pixel fitting is just making sure that as much of the icon as possible falls on the full pixel and aligns to the pixel grid. Notice in this example how all of the edges, strokes, details, all of that aligns to the grid and sits in full pixels. Next, let's talk color. While you're free to use any colors you would like, Elementary provides a great resource in the Elementary color palette provided in the icons repo. This is the palette we use for the Elementary icon set, and it has a wide selection of colors and weights of colors, just like fonts have weights. When choosing colors, don't be afraid to use vibrant colors in your icon. This will make them much more fun and recognizable and memorable. Also, Elementary tends to save the more boring colors for more boring things like system level stuff. Another thing to consider when choosing colors for your icons is what those colors may say about your app. For instance, green can be associated with go, safety, or success. Yellow or orange with urgency or caution or warning, and red with error, danger, or alert. We can use these colors to help convey a message or a feeling. This doesn't necessarily mean you should be confined to or avoid certain colors, but it is something you're going to want to think about. Next, let's talk measurements and exceptions. Although the canvas of our icon are the 16, 32, 48, 64, and 128 pixels squared, our icon doesn't extend to the full edges of those canvases, and there's space left for the icon to breathe. The HIG provides us with a set of measurements for a rounded square icon that gives us the baseline, X height, and mean line height. These are a great starting point for the general size of your icon. However, these aren't set in stone, as we're going to need to accommodate for an optical illusion that makes some shapes feel smaller than others at the same size. I call this visual weight, and we want to make sure our icons are the same visual weight as other icons on the OS. In our example, our icon has a similar visual weight as a rounded square, so it follows these measurements. However, if our icons were more round or a different shape altogether, we may need to extend the size of our icon to remain visually weighted the same. Next is outlines and contrast. Outlines help to give your icons contrast on a variety of backgrounds. We achieve this outline by giving our icons a 1 pixel semi-transparent outer stroke that's roughly 30% darker than the icon's background. With parts of the icon that are very bright nearing white, we use that 1 pixel stroke to contain those parts rather than sit partially on them. Here we can see the difference in contrast on a background between icons with an outline and those without. As you can see, the icons with an outline stand out much better than those without. Next is lighting. Lighting is an important factor in the creation of our icon and one that's easily misunderstood. Lighting is why our icons use gradients, have highlights, and cast shadows. Lighting is what grounds our icon in a degree of realism. Understanding the lighting will go a long way in understanding the process of making an icon. Imagine your icon was sitting on a shelf with a light directly above it, like in the top left image. This explains the soft drop shadow and edge lighting around the icon being brightest at the top. The material of your icon, along with the lighting, will influence the gradients you use to make your icon. If your icon is glossy, your materials will have brighter reflections, and so your gradients will be harsher. Likewise, if your material is matte, you'll have a much softer gradient. Next, let's talk about highlights. Highlights act as edge lighting and consist of a 1 pixel inner stroke on the edges of the icon and anywhere light would catch, like seams. Our highlights will be brightest at the top and slightly brighter at the bottom than the sides, as light would bounce up from the shelf our icon sits on. The amount of transparency of this white inner stroke really depends on the color and material of the icon below it. In the top right image there, you can see I've taken our icon, stripped it of the details, and exaggerated the highlights so you can more easily see what's going on. Next is shadows. Because the light is coming from the top, our icon will cast a fuzzy drop shadow underneath itself. The shape of your icon's shadow will depend on the shape of your icon. In our example, the bottom of our icon comes to a point, so the shadow is much more intense towards the center and is much softer as the edges of the icon get farther and farther away from the surface it sits on, as shown in that bottom left image. Next, we want to talk about material. When creating details and gradients in our icon, we need to think about the materials our icon is made of. Is it more glossy or matte? If it's glossy, it will reflect more light. Let's look at our example in the bottom right. Here we have 2 different materials, glass and metal. Because glass is super reflective, we have a glare on the screen portion of the icon. But the sandblasted metal part of the icon is more matte, so it has no glare and a subtle gradient. Next, let's talk about pictograms. If your icon has a pictogram, you can give it shadows and highlights to make it appear extruded from or inset into the background. This gives our icon further depth and gives the pictogram more contrast against that background. To make an outset shadow, we start by duplicating the pictogram, making it solid black at 15% opacity, shifting it down 1 pixel, and sending it behind the image. Next, we duplicate that shadow again and give it a 1 pixel stroke and set it to 7% opacity. This will give a subtle drop shadow to your pictogram that makes it appear slightly lifted from the background. To make a pictogram appear inset into the background, we basically want to make that same shadow, but inside of the pictogram. Start by making your pictogram a darker shade or gradient of the icon's background. Then we duplicate it twice and shift it 1 of those duplicates down 1 pixel. And then do a difference path cut. Make it black at 15% opacity. Duplicate the original pictogram twice again, and this time shift 1 of the duplicates down 2 pixels and do a difference path cut. Make it black at 7% opacity. Now duplicate the original pictogram once more and make it white. Shift it down 1 pixel and send it behind everything and set the opacity to match your highlights. You should now have an inset pictogram with shadow and highlight, with shadows inside and a highlight underneath. Next, let's talk about composition. Another thing we need to consider when creating our icons is the composition. If you plan on adding more elements to your icon than a pictogram, you're going to have to consider how much detail to put in. Too little detail and your icon will look boring and have a hard time conveying its message. Too much detail and your icon will look too busy and won't scale well. However, this doesn't mean that all your elements need to be the same or present at all sizes. You'll need to find that line and understand how and where to change or cut out some of those features as you scale down. The trick is to only cut or change elements that don't define your icon. This shouldn't discourage you from adding details as your icon to your icon, however, as more detailed icons are the most interesting. Let's look at our example. Here we have a pictogram of braces and some lines in the back that look like code on a screen. It would be impossible to scale that code down to smaller sizes and have it look exactly the same. So as we go down in size, we recreate the detail to fit our icon's size. Until at the smallest side, the code was indistinguishable. So we just removed it altogether. We can't remove the pictogram because it's a defining feature of our icon that conveys our icon's story. However, the code is just background detail that adds more context to our icon but doesn't define it. Now I want to show you a demonstration of an icon being made and talk you through what I'm doing as we go. First, we're going to start out by making our rounded square. The same rounded square we all know and love. Here I am setting the measurements and centering it onto the canvas, giving it the correct border radius. And now we're going to work on our highlights, our white inner stroke highlight. As you can see, we're aligning all of it to the pixel grid and keeping it inside those full pixels. Next, we're going to work on what's going to be the point of the bottom of the icon and its inner highlight. Next, we're putting it to the bottom of that square because we know that's where our measurements are going to be. And now we can work on making our base shape, our chat bubble shape. I'm going to do a union of the background and the highlights. And there's our base shape. You can see we have a 1 pixel outer stroke for the outline and a 1 pixel inner stroke for the highlights. Next, I'm going to work on the highlights for the seam. Now we're duplicating the original base shape so we can separate it into its parts, the metal part and the glass part. Now we're going to set our gradient for the screen, for the glass part. Now we're going to separate our outer line and set it to the right opacity and color. And then we're going to do the same for the metal part, or the bottom. And we're going to give it its gradient. Now we're going to bring out those highlights to the front on top of everything and start setting them to the right opacities. We're going to put a gradient on the main outline so that it can be brightest at top and a little brighter at the bottom and dimmest at the edges. We're going to set the opacity to match and work on making sure everything aligns in full pixels. Next, we're going to make that glare on the screen. This just gives a little extra detail and really emphasizes that that top layer is made out of glass. Next, we'll bring in our pictogram, position it in the right place, and start working it and making it outset. So we're going to duplicate the pictogram, bring it down 1 pixel, set it to black at 15% opacity. Then we're duplicating that, giving it a 1 pixel black stroke and setting it all to 7% opacity and sending it behind it. There it is. Now I bring in some other details. And we'll send those to the back at the end. Now we're going to work on the shadow. As I said, our shadow is more intense towards the center as we have a point that comes down. So we're going to have to layer up our shadows a little bit. So here I am making towards that point. I'm making the shadow there. And now we're going to make the shadow for the edges of the icon. This is going to be a much more subtle shadow as the icon is farther away from the surface. Now we're going to set that outline's transparency and send our details to the back. And we're done. I hope this has been helpful for you in understanding how elementary app icons are made, and you're leaving this talk with a better idea of how to go about making your own. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of EDW. Thank you.
Wow, that was a great talk and a handsome icon, I'll say. I'll click that app, whatever it is. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined live by Micah and Dan for some Q&A.
Micah, thank you so much for putting that together. That was so cool to see you like working. I think a lot of people haven't really seen that behind the scenes before, right? But to see like the way you snap things into place and going from just like a rectangle to something that was like a great icon was really cool.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So a lot of people are asking like, what tools do you use to draw icons?
I use Inkscape. I use the FlatHub version of Inkscape, but honestly, you can use about any tool that you're comfortable with, but as long as it does SVGs. But my personal tool is Inkscape for now. After the Akira talk, I'm looking at that like maybe I need to learn that. But
what about before you jump into your illustration software? Do you do any kind of like brainstorming with sketches or any other tools like that, or do you just dive straight in?
It depends on the icon and whether I have a good idea for it or not. Sometimes I'll grab a notebook and just start sketching things because it's sometimes a little quicker than just hashing it out on Inkscape. But yeah, it depends. Sometimes I just hash it out on Inkscape because I'm pretty comfortable with it.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a comfort level thing, right? I totally do the same thing. Like sometimes I'll jump into the notebook, but other times I'm like, man, let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
What about during like the research phase? Do you like spend a lot of time looking at, other kinds of icons or doing some like, things like that?
Yeah, if there's a icon that's got a little more difficult of a metaphor, I'll research on prior art and, what are other people saying represents this idea or this message that they're trying to convey. And I'll use that to help shape what I'm doing. And yeah, there's a little bit of research into it, especially for the metaphors. And if there's something more complex that I'm trying to get across, like a certain lighting or something, I'll look at resource images and things like that to see what real lighting works like.
Yeah, and you talked about use of color a little bit in your talk, right? And do you think a lot about like kind of color theory concepts when you're trying to pick out the colors for your icons?
Yeah, I definitely think about what that color is going to say about the icon. Is it going to come across as a negative thing or a positive thing? Is it? And I like to think about going into the operating system and thinking where colors are used in that. Like I know orange is used for the music app. Is this something musical? Would orange benefit from here? Or the system settings, we use purple for sharing, and does that would that benefit by being purple here to keep a consistent theme going on of what does the message convey? Yeah.
That's a really good point, is trying to keep things in like kind of icon families, right? So they all feel grouped together. Let's see. Alessandro wants to know if you have recommendations or best practices to speed up the process of making different sizes of icons.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to kit bash. So I rarely ever do I start from scratch on an icon. I will grab an icon from the operating system and work from it. If it's close to the shape or whatever, then I can work from that, and that solves some of the sizing things. That solves some of the highlights and things like that. It's beneficial to work from a starting point. So there are templates you can use. There are, like I said, you can just go into your icons from the operating system and grab something that's similar there. And yeah, don't feel like you have to start from scratch every single time.
Yeah, and I know you put together a great template pack, and we recently started linking to that from our developer docs to get you started with someplace to do your icons, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's a little different right now because we started doing some experiments with shape, so and border radius. So it's a little different from what's shipped now, but maybe in future it'll be back up to par. I might make it go. I might revert.
So what do you think is the best size to start designing your icon from? Should we start like at the maximum size up at 128, or should we start at a smaller size and scale it up?
I typically start somewhere in the middle. So I usually start at 64 or 48 pixels. That gives me a base of what detail I can fit in, what detail I can add, what detail I can remove. Like that gives me a good starting point of where to go. And it might be different for everyone. Maybe you really need to know what it's going to look like at its smallest size first to really wrap your head around what it's going to look like at the bigger sizes. Or maybe you need that full 120 pixel to really understand what it's going to look like across. It's a personal preference, but I like to start somewhere in the middle.
I got a cat right here. Okay, come on, bud. Okay. And what do you think about like someone wants to know, do you think that we're going to have like really huge icon sizes in the future? Like should they plan to scale their icons up to like 256 pixels or something large like that?
I don't think so. The bigger icon sizes are usually high DPI usage. So, and those are pixel doubled. So the same sizes will look the same way on high DPI. You don't need to make a 256 pixel icon for high DPI. You can make the 128 pixel and it'll scale up because it's pixel doubled. Don't want to confuse that scaling happens just magically. It's because of pixel doubling, but it depends on where we go for the UI. We pick icons that fit a specific use case in the operating system. So I don't foresee anything right now, but that could change in the future.
And what about like your alignment? It looks like sometimes you have shapes that are aligned like to full pixels, but when you're adding a stroke, that sometimes they get aligned to like half pixels. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I use a grid of a full pixel and a half pixel grid because when you're aligning things, you want them to fit in the full pixel. So the center of it may end up on a half pixel, or the alignment snapping point might be on a half pixel. So I put a half pixel grid so that I can align and it sit inside the full pixel. But
yeah, so when you've got like a shape, right, with a stroke on it, that the snap point for that shape might be on a half pixel, even though the stroke fills up like the whole pixel, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. What do you think about like trends in icon design? Like we've seen a ton of trends come and go over the last like 10 years, right? Like we've had hyper realistic icons, we've had the white backgrounds with plain colored pictograms on them, long shadows. Like first of all, what is your favorite one of these trends?
So,
or least favorite?
my least favorite is the white background with a pictogram on it. That it just makes everything really hard to find. My favorite, it's not practical, but I have a soft spot for the hyper realistic ones. But I think where we sit is a nice balance between having some grounded, like being grounded in some realism with some real lighting going on, and not being too flat, too undetailed, because I think flat icons are a trend. I do think they're a trend. And I think that we're going to start seeing, and I think we are seeing, more shadows, more depth, more lighting come back into icons as we get further along. I think we're on the upswing from that. And so I think we sit in a good spot. I don't like chasing the trends. I like sitting where we have a reason we sit where we sit. You know, we are grounded in a little realism. We're grounded in, you know, we have that depth and that shadow and things that really help separate us from the background and give us more contrast. So I'm not a trend chaser, but I do see the trends, and my favorite are the ones that add more detail. My least favorite are the ones that take it all away.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate you coming on and answering all these questions. There are a lot of great questions in the chat, but we got to get rolling with the next talk. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And the next talk does roll right along. Coming up now is GTK for web developers.
Presented by Darshik Parikh, this talk draws parallels between web development concepts and techniques you may be familiar with and their equivalents in the world of GTK.
Welcome to GTK for web developers. And if you have been developing web applications for a while, or if that is something that you are familiar with, or if that's your work, then if you try to look at the desktop side of things and you try to look at how GTK applications work, then it can sometimes feel a bit daunting because the toolchain and the workflow is not something you are used to. It is not even similar to what you may have used in, say, JS. So it can feel slightly overwhelming if that's where you come from. But if you get past that step, and if you try to write an actual application and try to see how stuff renders on the screen, you will find that a lot of the principles are pretty much the same as they are in the web, except that they are written slightly differently. But you can carry over a lot of your understanding, and it will pretty much work the same way. So before we talk about the similarities, we want to get the toolchain part, the first step, out of the way. So let us take a brief moment to discuss the languages that you may want to use while writing a GTK application. So in web, you may be used to writing either plain JS, which includes the superset JSX, or you might be used to one of the languages which transfile to JavaScript. So in GTK, we have quite a lot of options, not just the ones I have written here. You can write GTK applications in pretty much any popular language. You can totally write in Java or Go if you want to. However, these 5 are the ones that are either supported by, they have official bindings maintained by the GNOME team, or even if they are community efforts in case of Rust and Python, they are still at least they are quite stable and reliable and up to date usually. So these are the 5 languages that you might want to go into most of the time. So Vala is the one in which all the default elementary OS applications are written. And a good majority of the applications you find on App Center will also be written in Vala. So it is easy to find a lot of examples of things you may have seen in one application. So you can just look at the source code of that application and you can pick out what you need based on that. That has benefited me personally a lot. And it transpiles to C code. It does not compile directly to binary. It transpiles to C code, which in turn gets compiled to native binary. So you get all the performance benefits of C, of native code, while still not having to write actual C code, because C might not be everyone's cup of tea. So Vala gives you a lot of high level features. And if you have even written simple applications in either Java or C Sharp, then Vala will feel at home for you. Of course, you can still write direct C, but if that's your way, if that's what you like, then of course, more power to you. There is Rust, which also like C and C++ compiles to native binary code, so you get the performance benefits and memory safety benefits. But in Rust in any other language besides Vala, you do not get Granite or Granite, depending on where you live. So Granite is this library which we will talk about later in the talk, and it is a first-party library maintained by the Elementary team. Provides a lot of useful stuff. We'll talk about it, but it is only available if you use Vala. If you want to use those patterns in another language, you will have to implement it yourself and maintain parity with Granite, which might not be what you want to do. So that's it. JavaScript, of course, you as a web developer, you might be tempted to use JavaScript, which is a perfectly fine choice. But one point to note is that the version of JavaScript bindings that is most commonly used is GJS, maintained by the GNOME team. And a lot of the GNOME applications are written in GJS. So it is quite stable. However, it is based on the SpiderMonkey JavaScript engine, which powers Firefox browser. It is not based on Node.js, so you cannot take an arbitrary NPM dependency and expect it to work inside your application. So keep that in mind if you do pick JavaScript. You can, however, use dev dependencies at your local development setup, and you might want to use, say, Babel for transpiling, or you might want to use ESLint or Prettier, stuff like that. And it will do its job on your development machine. However, when you ship that application, you will have to ship it in a way that complies with the GJS standards, which does not really work with CommonJS or the standard Node.js module system that you may be used to. So keep that in mind. Python is a great use case when you want to use one of the libraries which only ship with, which are only available in Python. I recently saw this application called QuickWord by Adi Hezral. It uses the NLTK, the Natural Language Toolkit. It's a popular natural language library for Python. And if you have a specific dependency like that, this is a no-brainer. This list is not for you. You just pick the language in which it is available. But if you have a doubt, if you are not sure what to pick, go with Vala is what I would suggest. Okay, so let's talk about the similarities. And starting with the DOM that you are used to in the web world. In GTK, we have something very similar. Everything is a hierarchy of elements, except that instead of that being a document being directly available, you have to create a window object. You have to manually create it, and it represents a window, a standard window that you see on the GUI. This is a simplification. It is not the but enough. That is enough to understand the concept. And each window has a tree, and the tree is comprised of different widgets. Widgets are comparable to elements, and each widget has properties, which you might call attributes in JavaScript. And the term property makes a lot of sense in terms of GTK, because when we say property, it corresponds. So Each widget is an object, as in the object-oriented programming object. So the term that we commonly use in object-oriented programming to define the data that we associate with objects is property. So each widget has properties, which is quite straightforward if you think about it that way. And once you are familiar with these terms, you can understand a lot of the documentation that you will find. And speaking of widgets, GTK comes with a lot of inbuilt widgets. I mean, it requires 3 pages to so much as demonstrate those. And it has everything you might imagine, from all types of inputs, combo boxes, check boxes, toggle buttons, progress bars, stepped progress bars, range sliders, font pickers, color pickers, loads of stuff. It has, sorry. So this library is quite vast. It is much vaster than what you have in HTML. So when you want to, so you will not require third party, like not require additional libraries for a lot of the stuff which you do on the web. And if you look at a site called Valadoc, you can explore all of these options and you can see how they work, how you can create them, and we'll get to that as well. And how do you create this stuff? How do you get this stuff on the screen? So, okay, so this talk uses Vala for all the examples, but you should be able to translate it to pretty much any language because it works mostly the same way. In fact, most of the code that is written here is nearly valid JavaScript. So it works the same way in pretty much any language. Okay, so manipulating this tree, this hierarchy of elements, is something that for which I would like to take a page from the React book. In React, you are used to writing JSX, which is a declarative way of defining your elements. However, in GTK, we don't do that. We write everything in an imperative form, and we define everything in terms of programming statements. So it would be easier to compare it to what JSX becomes after transpiling via Babel to standard JavaScript, which you ship into the browser. And this JSX actually turns into this reactor.create element, name of the element, an object containing all the attributes that you want to assign to it, and finally the text content of the said element. So in GTK, you do something similar, like not syntactically exactly, but you define any widget using the new keyword because every widget is an object, like I said. So you will find this pattern very often, and every widget you will create like this. And this is a shorthand syntax where you want to assign properties to an object. There is, of course, an even shorter way of doing this, but we will leave that out for now. This is equivalent to saying var button equals new GTK button, semicolon, end of statement. And in the next statement, you say button.label equals bool, button.sensitive equals false. And this is a nicer shorthand way of saying that. So this is a Vala specific thing, but that's how this works. You create something and you assign properties to it, much like how you did here. And then you are also used to, like, just defining something using react.create element does not put it on the screen. It simply defines it in memory. And when you want to put it on the screen, you do this react.dom.render and you select where you want it to go. Similarly, you want to create a window. So just like when you get in web, you get the document object available to you, in which you can simply document dot create element and you can do stuff. You do not get a window object created for you. You have to do that manually, and you have to add whatever widgets you want to add to it, like this window.add name of the widget. So one thing to note here is that anything that is in the scope, any widget that you have defined in this scope is readily available to you, and you can modify its properties from pretty much anywhere within the scope. So that is something to be careful about, because it is a powerful approach. You can change your objects properties from anywhere, but you know what they say about great power. It can be dangerous. So keep that in mind. Um, Similarly, there are ways to remove stuff and reposition stuff same way that you do in that you might be used to in JavaScript, DOM JavaScript. Now that we have talked about tree manipulation, you also want to make sure that your widgets show up at the right position on the screen. And for that, in web, you are likely using flexboxes. We have something similar on the GTK side of things, except that we do it in an imperative way in the GTK way. So when you define a flex element with display flex, and you may specify a flex direction of column, or you may leave it out, in which case it will default to row. And you may use this recently introduced property called gap. I believe this does not yet work on all browsers, but it is what will define the spacing between the elements. So in GTK side, we have something similar, just imperative. So like I said, you define an object using the constructor. A flexbox is called a box. So GTK box is what you want to do. And it takes two arguments. First is the orientation, which is either vertical or horizontal, which corresponds to column or row in your flexbox side. And the second argument is the spacing between the elements, which is similar to gap 4 pixels. And adding an item to that box is as simple as box.append box item. Of course, you can do pre-append, you can insert it at a specific position, but this is the most basic way of adding them in a sequence. And if we are talking about layouts, we can obviously not miss grid layout. And grid works notoriously similar to how it does on the web. So in web, you are used to like having a grid parent, like grid container with a number of children, which will be positioned according to the grid area that you define for them. Or if you don't define them, they will go into the next available slot. That doesn't quite work exactly in GTK, but you have to add each item manually to the grid, and you have to specify the position. So when you define a grid container, you may specify the row gap and the column gap between the children of the grid. It works pretty much the same way in GTK. You define a new GTK grid and you assign some value to the row spacing and column spacing properties, which will work the same way. And adding the grid item is also it takes the same things. So if you say justify self center and align self end, it will, in the default case, it will correspond to horizontal align center and vertical align end. However, note that in grid, we have the default grid direction set to row. And if you change that to column, if you say grid direction column, and if you, in that case, align self and justify self will interchange their roles. So justify will do it along the vertical axis, while align will do it along the horizontal axis. However, in GTK, these are fixed. H and V mean horizontal and vertical. So you can always say for sure where a certain element will go. And note that we do not use the words left and right. We use start and end in both places. In web and GTK, we use the words start and end. This is because if you are using a left to right language like English, then end will correspond to right and start will correspond to left. But if you hard code that to left and right, then it might not make sense for somebody who is using it in, say, Hebrew or Arabic or Urdu. Then, so that's why we specifically say end. So GTK will look at what language the user is currently using the application in and decide accordingly what start and end mean. And talking about how we want to position the grid elements, we so we have this grid area property, which is a composite, which is a like a shorthand where you say in which grid line the positioning of the element begins. So in this case, it begins at the second grid line horizontally, second grid row line, and the third column line. But this 2 and 3 become 1 and 2 in case of GTK because we use column numbers in GTK. So these line numbers start from 1 in case of web, but the column numbers in GTK start from 0. So 2 and 3 become 1 and 2. So straightforward, you just subtract 1 from them. And you use this notation to define how many rows a certain element will span and how many columns it will span. You do exactly the same thing in GTK. When you so you grid dot attach a grid item and you specify its position and its span values. So it can determine where to place it and how much space to take. Next, when we talk about styling stuff, we talked about layout, but when I say styling, I mean specifically things like colors, typography, transition, margin, padding, that kind of stuff. It's, things that don't relate directly to layout, as in flex or grid, but things that relate to the appearance of the element which has already been placed. So in web, you are used to, let's say there's a text entry and you are used to saying this text entry class flat. Let's say you want to have a text entry which does not look like a text entry. It looks like there's no border and there's no background. It looks like it's a part of the usual text flow, like a span, but it is actually in input. If you want to do that style, then you will say something like this: background transparent, border none. You will define maybe a CSS property for the color, and you will assign that to the color, and you will say font. So this stuff in GTK you can do almost exactly the same stuff. Defining variables is somewhat different. You do it like this, but everything else is the same. You can use a subset of the web CSS in your GTK application, and it will do exactly what you expect it to do. And the way to add this stuff to an element is you define the element, and you can, in GTK4 at least, you can say entry.add CSS class flat, but and that works only in GTK4. So in 3, you might want to do this get style context.add class flat, which also works in 4. Both of them work in 4, but this is much nicer. Next, one thing that you will do once you have laid stuff out on the screen is you will want to inspect it and see what is going on with it. So you can use this command here to enable the GTK inspector. It is disabled by default because it is not something which we want a user to accidentally trigger. So, but once you enable it, you can either say Control-Shift-D to launch it, or you can say Control-Shift-I while hovering on a widget. So it will inspect that widget, and it will work kind of like the browser inspector, the web inspector. You can see each property that is assigned to that, like its value, its data type, defined at which level, because so if you have a GTK label, then the label is actually a subclass of GTK widget, which is a subclass of GTK dot something else. So So yeah, you can see where it is coming from and what is its value, what is its type. You can even see the CSS which is being applied on that. So most of the usual stuff that you are used to in the web inspector. There is a, if you look at this, if you go into this menu, there is even a way to look at the tree, the hierarchy of elements that are going on in the window. So this is something that you will find useful. And lastly, let us talk about some of the UI libraries. So okay, so I've given a few web examples here. I know that jQuery UI is not something we use these days, but if that is something that you may have used in the past, then you will be able to make a fair comparison as to what I'm referring to on the right. So jQuery UI, Material UI, they provide a lot of pre-built widgets and a lot of styles layouts. Whereas Bulma, Bootstrap, and Friends provide a lot of CSS classes, which are CSS styles which are defined in classes. And these libraries do kind of the same thing. Granite is what the elementary team has developed, and it provides a lot of it provides things that comply with the elementary human interface guidelines. So you will in many cases you will find some of the patterns mentioned in the human interface guidelines implemented in Granite because they are not implemented in base GTK standard. If they are, if they eventually do get implemented, then they get deprecated from Granite because, of course, why not? Why maintain two implementations? And there's libhandy, which provides. It was originally developed for the touchscreen devices by Purism, but of late it has been taken under the GNOME umbrella and is maintained by Loom. And it provides things like multi-touch gestures. It provides rounded corners on windows. It provides a lot of useful stuff, which you find in neither in base GTK nor in Granite. So you will find that being used in a lot of elementary first-party applications as well. And so the continuation of Handy in GTK4 is called libadwaita, which is something that GNOME team is maintaining, of course, because it is pretty much a successor to Handy. Handy will not be ported onwards to GTK4 from what I know, and libadwaita will replace it in the GTK4. So you will want to use either of these depending on what GTK version you are using and what features you need. Of course, not every application might benefit from those, but yeah, they are useful libraries that you want to keep in mind. And now for a few resources. You want to go and check out the elementary developer documentation, of course, which is a great starting point, which defines all the all the recommended steps to develop an application in Vala. It focuses on Vala, but at least the build process and the Git procedure is something which you can apply to pretty much any language. So go and check it out. I will, of course, host these slides on the web. So you will be able to open this up and click on this link directly. So of course, you go and check it out, and also check out the human interface guidelines if you want to see how an application is designed. Next, if you want to, so GTK, this is a page that lists out all the GTK, all the CSS properties that are the subset of CSS properties that are supported by GTK. One thing that you will instantly notice is that this does not have the display property like display flex, display grid, display block, whatever. This does not have that because that is defined in the imperative part of the program. That is defined via whatever Vala or whichever language you are using. So, but it has all the styling elements like we saw earlier. And you will see you will see text stuff, color, color and opacity, margins, paddings, the usual stuff. If you are choosing Vala, then do go through the official Vala tutorial on the GNOME wiki. This is pretty much all you will need if you have worked with another programming language. But if you are new to programming itself, that is a different story. I believe there are other resources. I don't know. So yeah, go through this. This will explain the Vala language to you. And once you understand the language, and you want to move forward to how to use the ecosystem that comes with Vala, how to look at the libraries, then Valadoc is your friend. It apparently stays crunchy even in mill. I have no idea what that line means, but that is the tagline. And this will, so this has a list of all the G object libraries, which is something. So G object is the underlying system that powers glib and GTK and the entire ecosystem. So you will see an near exhaustive list of all the libraries that are supported in there, and you will see some useful packages like the GEE or G. G is for data structures. You find things like promises and maps and sets in here, or there's a library called Soup for HTTP connections. A lot of useful stuff in here, and these links are also quite useful if you want to get started with Vala language. So yeah, go and check out valadoc.org. And that is all from my side. Thank you for watching.
That was a fascinating talk, and now it's time for a live Q&A with Darshik and Elementary co-founder Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
And again, a great talk. I know we were talking a little bit before about how you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself very well during your talk. So I guess first tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I am Darshak, and I've been using Elementary OS for like 6 years now, and have developed a couple of apps for that. If you've come across an app called Badger, that is my fault. And I have an upcoming app which I will release directly on Odin. It's called Obliviate. Look out for it. And yeah, I do contribute once in a while.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, it's great to put faces to names and faces to apps. People may have used the app and never knew the person behind it, and now they do. So I know sometimes developers, especially those familiar with web technologies, can struggle to know if they can or should include web content in their native apps. They're coming from a world of web development and they're building a native app. I guess, can you touch on that a bit? Can they? Should they? Do you have a recommendation for that?
Yeah, so it depends. If you are showing some data which comes from like a nice API, then do not display the web content. Display it in as native a way as possible, so that you can use the platform's features like text magnification or dyslexia-friendly text, or so all of that stuff will integrate well if you are using the native components to build your app. However, there are some use cases in which you might want to display web content. There's this app called QuickDoc, which is basically a site-specific browser for Valadoc and some web docs. So it displays the web content of those sites basically and makes it easy to navigate. So for that, it makes sense. If it's a use case like that, it makes sense. Otherwise, you want to go with native whenever possible.
Yeah, exactly. If you're pulling in third-party data that is only available as in a web format, then it can make sense there. As long as the majority of your user interface and the thing that users actually interact with isn't done in web technologies, as long as it's native. And actually, for anybody watching at home, the App Center submission guidelines explicitly omit web apps or apps that provide most of their UI in a web frame from being accepted in App Center. But including rich content in WebKit is a huge advantage of GTK in our platform. Apps like Mail, the native Mail app, use a web view to render emails, but the interface for the app itself is done in native GTK. So there's always kind of a trade-off and a line there that you can find in your app and what makes sense. Somebody asked if there's an NPM package called Node GTK that you can use to develop GTK apps with Node.js. Can you touch on that a little bit if you're familiar with it?
Yes, I am familiar with this package. Node GTK is it's an attempt to base the GTK bindings on the Node.js platform rather than the SpiderMonkey engine which GJS uses, which would be a huge advantage because you would be able to use most of the Node.js dependencies that you can fetch from NPM. And however, from what I last know about Node GTK, it is not as mature as GJS at the moment. So you might want to wait a while before using it in production, but definitely something to keep an eye out on.
Yeah. So I know if you're a web developer coming from that world, you're very familiar with Node and NPM. And I guess the equivalent there, if you're going full in on native development, is, there are development libraries that are included in the operating system or made available as dependencies in the operating system. So it's a little bit of a shift in thinking. I know I come from a web background and now do native development. So it's a little bit of a shift in thinking that the operating system itself provides all your dependencies. But of course, now with Flatpak, you can also vendor your dependencies into your app as well, more like what we're familiar with web development. So we're kind of seeing both worlds there of being able to depend on the platform's existing libraries and vendoring your own. So that's definitely a place to look as well as into Flatpak. Somebody was asking how much, they were asking about translations and localization in GTK. And I know that's something that's difficult to do and not really standardized on the web. Can you touch on that a bit with GTK?
Yeah. So in GTK, we have the standard get text and PO, the dependencies that we use for any app that goes into App Center. And there is documentation about it on docs.elementary.io as to how to do it. Very clear instructions on how to do it. And even outside the elementary platform, even GNOME and others use the same standard to translate. So it works quite well across the board. However, in web, you cannot say that there are no standards. There is something in the DOM APIs, but then there's no every framework does its own thing. Angular has its own thing to do internationalization. React has a few libraries going on. So everybody does their own thing. There's a lot of fragmentation going on in the web side of things. Not so in the desktop Linux world.
Yeah. Again, another advantage of native platform development is this stuff's been figured out. It's been sorted out. It's easy for you to just use the platform defaults instead of reinventing the wheel. Somebody was asking also about how much does CSS, and I know you talked about this a little bit in your talk, but how much does CSS or SCSS translate to GTK CSS coming from web standards?
Yes, so the GTK CSS is a subset of the web CSS, and the page that I mentioned on the GTK website will give you an exhaustive list of all the properties that are supported. But in general, if you want to know what will be supported, look for things that you can use to style the elements rather than lay them out and position them on the screen. So positioning is something that is usually done with the layouts, the grids, and the boxes of the GTK world, which you do imperatively using whatever language you are using. However, when you want to style, when you want to set a margin, when you want to control the typography, control colors, backgrounds, even transitions, that stuff is something you would want to do with CSS.
Yeah. And as a follow-up, they were asking too, if you can use SCSS for in your third-party app on Elementary OS. We've talked about we use SCSS when we develop this platform style sheet, but it gets translated into CSS. So they're asking, can you use SCSS?
Yeah, so the Elementary style sheet has is entirely written in CSS, and so you can, in theory, use that for apps. I have not tried that, but I believe you should be able to do that by requiring the Sass dependency in your Meson and adding the instructions for that. And you will want to compile those before installing all the dependencies into the system, like before triggering the build process. Like it would be the first step in your build.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing I think it's important to mention is GTK CSS has support for some SCSS-like functions like color mixing, alpha transparency, even variables. Those are all included as part of GTK CSS. So sometimes when you you can do something in SCSS, it might be possible to do it just natively in GTK CSS as well.
Yeah.
And I think we've got just one or two more questions here. Somebody was asking, is there a way to do responsive arrangement in a grid, like switching between a horizontal and vertical layout when the width reduces to a certain size? Is that something you're familiar with?
I don't think there's a way to, like, there's an equally elegant way to do that as we have in the web side of things. But I may not be fully aware about it.
Yeah, as far as
it's usually something. Yeah, go ahead.
As far as I know, I think that's where something like libhandy steps in with some of those more responsive design elements. So it's not something you do so much in CSS in GTK, but you would do it with a library like Handy, or in GTK itself. You could manage those things. I've seen some really cool responsive app demos where the toolbar changes where it is or how it's oriented exactly depending on the size of the window. So that's another way to keep it consistent with other apps on the platform, is to lean on those libraries like Handy. And I think that's all we have from the chat for Q&A. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks for answering some questions.
Thank you very much.
Right on. Well, that was a great talk, and that was a great Q&A. It's really awesome to see kind of that contrast between the web platform and our platform, and kind of brings everything back around to what we were talking about from the beginning, right? And kind of what our platform looks like and what we can offer to developers who maybe aren't familiar with native app development yet. So I just want to say thank you very much to everybody for attending the very first EDW. This was super fun to do, and I hope you got lots of great information and learned some new things from it. I'm really excited to keep doing this. We definitely want to continue to grow the conference every year, and you being a part of this really helps show the desire for this kind of knowledge. And yeah, I'm overwhelmed with thanks. This has been really cool.
Yeah, it's been a great experience, and I'm so glad we were able to pull it off, and I look forward to doing it in the future for years to come. If you missed a talk, or you want to check out any of the previous talks or the schedule, we'll have them up on edw.elementary.io for your viewing, and we're also going to upload them and get them posted later.
Thank you, guys. We enjoyed it. Thank you from the JB Studios. You can find links like everything that Cassidy just mentioned there at edw.elementary.io. Thanks to the sponsors who made this stream possible. Really, it is thanks to their contribution. This weekend was made possible by them. And over 500 recurring GitHub sponsors. You can view them all over at github.com/sponsors/elementary. And everybody listed right there on the screen.
Don't forget to check back on the Elementary YouTube channel, where these talks will get split up and posted individually sometime soon. That's it for this EDW. Thank you so much for joining us.